One night when I was 10, I was asleep in bed and was woken up by my bedroom door opening and someone sitting on my bed. I felt the graze on my leg and my bed sank as they sat. Thinking it was my mom having to tell me something, I opened my eyes only to see a pale, eyeless boy who seemed to be at my age sitting at the foot of my bed with his legs crossed staring at me. Or facing my direction since, he had no eyes. He reached his hand towards me and he was holding what seemed to be like a little black box. I was freaked out, but as I reached to grab it, he hesitantly pulled it back. I reached out further for it and said, "Give it." As I did so, I blinked, and by the time I reopened my eyes, he was gone. The spot of the bed that was sitting lifted back into place, but the imprint of someone still sitting there was present. I told my mom in the morning, and she was slightly freaked out but assured me I was just dreaming. Fast forward 5 years, I had my girlfriend over to do homework. After homework, she took a nap while she waited for her parents to pick her up. They arrived and I tried waking her to let her know. I nudged her and she opened her eyes so suddenly already while looking to the direction of the corner of the room, where she pointed where the walls meet the ceiling, lifting her finger and pointing. As fast as she awoke, she fell asleep again. I attempted to wake her up and she came to full consciousness. I asked her what the hell was that about and explained what she just did. She said, "Oh, I thought I was dreaming, but I saw on the wall, I saw a little boy with no eyes there in a Spider-Man pose staring at me." That's when I freaked out and told her the story, for the first time of when I saw what I guessed was the same kid. Fast forward another 5 years, still had been with the same girlfriend, but by this time we had a 2-year-old daughter. We were living in my old bedroom at my parents' house. My daughter would wake up at the same time every night and start talking. For a while I thought it was a normal baby thing until I noticed it was almost the same conversation every night. I playfully asked her one night, who is she talking to every night? She responded, "A little boy. He talks to me. He's nice. He's lost and he's looking for his mommy." I told my mom what had happened the next morning, and before I got to tell her what I thought, she said, "I remember what happened to you. Then your girlfriend? I have no idea what that is." By then, neither my girlfriend or I have seen this little boy after our first encounter. But my daughter continued her nightly conversations until we got our own place later that year. About 5 years ago, my mom started to date a guy she met on a dating site. That part is fine. I recently started dating the woman I would later become my wife when we both met online. Anyway, my wife and I never really liked this particular guy. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that, but just a little creepy. He was quiet, he kept his eyes closed a lot, and occasionally said things like offering my wife a chocolate and then popping one in his mouth, closing his eyes and beginning to moan, and he let it melt in his mouth. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, but he spent the entire several hours just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. Just before Christmas, my mom and this guy started having some difficulties. My wife and I were visiting her for the holidays, and she dropped all of her problems on us. We listened carefully and told her our opinions and suggested it would be better without him. She already had made her mind up, though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve of all days. We spent the night at my mom's and got out early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. The next day, as soon as we left, as we could get through the snow, my wife suggested we stop by my mom's house on the way, just to see if she was okay. My wife just got a really bad feeling about my mom's now ex-boyfriend. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't mean much because she lives so close enough to work she often walks there, and it hadn't snowed in her town just yet. She also never locks her door, which drives me crazy, so we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled the spill container and was leaking onto the floor that had made a puddle. My wife screamed and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. I nervously opened the freezer to find a bag of frozen cherries that had been opened, crammed into the freezer so that fell onto the ice dispenser and melted. TLDR, I thought my mom was decapitated by her crazy ex-boyfriend. I've told this story to a select few. While creepiest/scariest is subjective, in the context of my life, this is truly the creepiest and scariest unsolved mystery. I was a freshman in high school in my hometown of LA Cross, Wisconsin. I was sleeping over at my friend Tom's house. We were watching a movie in his living room and suddenly he got a phone call. I watched as he listened to what is being said on the other line. I watched as emotion poured over his face as he threw the phone across the room. After moments of crying, he told me that a boy at my high school had committed suicide. Now, I knew this boy only through seeing him in the halls. My friend Tom and I didn't go to the same high school, but Tom apparently had gone to the middle school with this boy. Apparently, Tom bullied him during those years. He wasn't proud of it, but to be honest, I was pretty surprised because he was a great guy. He had utter remorse. We decided to sneak out and go out for a walk. The year was roughly 1990, maybe 91. We were freshmen in high school and sneaking out was nothing new. We always did it, and at the time we weren't into drugs, alcohol, or partying. We just liked the freedom of walking the streets at night. The discussions were always great. Normally, we would go on a walk behind a big cemetery that was near my house. It was behind the train tracks that was still through La Crosse in that day. We loved the danger of the cemetery, the scares. We were kids. It was almost like a rite of passage. As we walked along the train tracks leading to the cemetery, we both stopped. To this day, I can't explain why. We'd walked that cemetery dozens of times and on scarier nights too. But for whatever reason, we just didn't want to go in there. I don't know if the thought of death was on our minds due to the classmate's suicide was a factor. Perhaps, regardless, without saying anything to each other, we stopped, turned around, and decided to head down a nearby street. Now, in retrospect, I do have to say that throughout this walk, things seemed very off. There wasn't a car in sight. This was a suburbia. Even walking through the town's main street was odd because there just wasn't any cars. Very odd, and it was roughly around midnight. It was a weekend night too. Where was everybody? Perhaps this was just a strange coincidence. Lastly, there had been something in the air. Both Tom and I felt it, and we even brought it up. It feels weird tonight. The air, the lights. So we decided to walk down a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a ditch with a simple up, down, up the trail, and then led to the street we lived on. Simple enough, you know. Keep in mind that as I get into this horrifying part of this story, that we were in the suburbs. These weren't old, creepy houses with strange individuals, and trees were pretty small. It wasn't a brand new development, but it wasn't that old either. So Tom and I are walking down the street. We're looking down the road beneath our feet as we talk. I don't remember the exact conversation at this particular moment. Perhaps we were talking about the tragedy of that night, or it could have easily been about Star Wars or Akira. As we approached the dead end, which was a few houses away, Tom and I suddenly stopped. We did so at the same time without saying a word to each other. Our heads slowly turned towards each other, both sensing something. The hair on our arms and back of our necks was standing high. Then our gaze slowly moved forward in unison, slightly to the right. And that's when we saw it. It was about 2 houses away, in a virtually barren front yard of a suburban house. Beside some bushes was a dark figure. It was someone or something in dark robes. No face, no features at all, just the robe. Now, this figure didn't acknowledge us at all, not yet at least. Instead, it walked or moved in a certain way. I can't articulate it correctly, as if it was walking in circles slowly, without really walking. It held something that was blowing in the wind, and yeah, the wind picked up a little bit as well. Another odd element was the light that illuminated it somehow. There was a street light a few houses up ahead, but it wasn't strong enough to illuminate this figure as it was. Tom and I were frozen. In fact, I'm almost frozen as I write this. It's been a while since I thought about this night, so we stood, frozen in fear, staring at this dark figure moving, yet doing so without even moving. It was holding something, or perhaps it was blowing something in the wind, more of its robe. We weren't very sure. We stared at this thing, I don't know for how long, until it stopped and suddenly looked up at us, as if it finally alarmed by our presence. That was enough for us. We ran as fast as we could, cutting through a side street that led us to a parallel street towards my neighborhood. This street led to a slight hill, and we rounded the corner and started running up the hill in a panic. We stopped because on top of that hill, we saw another dark figure with its arms raised. We turned around and ran away in the direction of Tom's house, which at this distance was at least 5 miles away. We ran. Time stood still. The next thing I remember, we were laying in the middle of a courtyard of some other neighborhood we'd never been in, gasping for breath. We sat up without saying a word. We walked in silence back to his house. The air felt normal again, and although we felt like we had a haze of sorts, albeit we were out of danger. We fell asleep at his house, and I woke up that next morning and just went home. A few days later, I rode my bike to that location. Perhaps it was shadow play. Perhaps there was a certain tree or bush that may be a for sale sign or something that made it look like there was something else there. Nothing. It was a completely open yard. Tom and I didn't speak of that night for a very long time, and years later when I brought it up, he replied, "Yeah, what the hell was that?" As if no time had even passed. What was it? I had no idea. We hadn't taken any drugs, we hadn't been drinking any alcohol. I often wonder if it could have been a haunting, a specter, a ghost. Maybe it was an alien abduction or sighting. We saw no craft, but there was still that unexplained light near it. Or maybe it was some kids just messing with us, but how could they have known we were coming? How could they be just so prepared? I just don't know. That was roughly 24 years ago, give or take. And yes, this is a true story. Sadly, my best friend Tom passed away suddenly a few months ago. I thought of this night during the funeral, and I thought of returning to that site. The thought of the odd coincidence of an unexpected and surprising death, just like my classmate that night. Is there a connection? Were we seeing some future fate for one of us, which sadly fell upon my best friend Tom? Was this all some kind of dual hallucination in my mind? No way. Either way, it still haunts me to this day. When my wife and I bought our first house, an old Victorian style built in the 50s, almost every night we heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running up and down the upstairs hallway and other weird random sounds. My wife mentioned it to one of the neighbors and they said it was probably just the peacocks on the roof. The house was backed up on a conservation area where wild peacocks lived and they would occasionally get up on their roofs too. That answer made sense, so we basically got used to it and eventually ignored it. Less than a year later, our son was born and he was 1. He would balance all of his toys on top of one another and made them all spin. Literally found the center of balance of various toys and would walk in a circle around the room, giving each a gentle touch just to keep it rotating. It was the weirdest and coolest thing I'd ever seen, but back to the story. When he was 2 or 3, we would hear him talking in his room at night. And one night I asked who he was talking to. He said, Tracy. I asked, who is Tracy? And he says, the girl who lives in the walls. She's usually nice, but sometimes she scares me. He described a girl with brown hair and a yellow dress who would play with him sometimes and occasionally wake him up at the night, but he didn't really seem that bothered by it, just startled. He would talk about her once in a while, but it really wasn't a common occurrence. A couple years later, we had added to the house and moved the master bedroom downstairs, switching the kids' rooms around. Our youngest now was in his old room and was about to transition from crib to toddler bed. She had always been a sound sleeper, but she cried almost every night in that room. Her first night in that toddler bed, we heard a loud thud, followed by screaming, and rushed into the room thinking she had fallen out of her bed. She was on the other side of the room, got her calmed down and backed her in bed, and it happened again and again the next night. So we ended up switching the kids' room back and they were fine again. We looked up the history of that house but didn't find anything that seemed like a missing girl or anyone named Tracy that lived there. Eventually our son stopped talking about her, and a few years later we ended up taking a job with another company and ended up moving. The house was empty for a few months after we moved, and the neighbor across the street called my wife the one day. She said about a week after we left, she saw our daughter looking out the window, so she waved to her. And that's when she remembered we didn't live there anymore. Saendo. Hey guys, it's been a while, hasn't it? 7 months. Wow, I really should have pushed for 9 months and then told you guys I was pregnant the whole time. Oh man, you see 2020 and like your plans and goals for the year, they didn't match whatsoever. I don't think it matched for you. It definitely didn't match for me. Like I thought I'd be able to like upload so frequently and just enjoy making YouTube videos, but nah. Instead, it was just misery for I don't know how long, but you know, your boy is back. He's kicking. I don't know who missed me, but I am here. So yeah, I promise to upload a lot more frequently, not once every 7 months. I think that would be a terrible idea. I'll float into irrelevancy for the rest of my career. And yeah, you know, it has been a hard year, but let's edge it through. You know, I wanted to set myself a goal that, you know, let's make a Halloween video, and I didn't have enough time, but I really want to push myself because this whole year has just had a hold on everyone else. So, you know, this is my small victory, and I guess we can all have our own small victories against 2020. But yeah, also closing note, I do have a Twitter. Yeah, Twitter. It's kaibaka_twit or TWT. You can just give me a follow there. I'm pretty active there. I've been active. It's also very lonely there, so if you want to interact with me and anything like that, you can give me a follow, and I'll probably update you guys on a little bit more video ideas and whatnot. I do have a few ideas, but you know, let's just see where it might go, you know. So yeah, so thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video. Take care and peace.